What a story. This parable of the wedding banquet, as it's called in Matthew, is very recognizable and memorable parable. And in seminary, I did a big research paper on this very parable. It's called an exegesis, or we like to call it extra Jesus. But I'm not going to bore you with that paper today. If you want to read it, I'll let you. But this parable appears in various forms. It's in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 14, and it's also in the Gospel of Thomas, chapter 64, which is not in the Bible, but that's a very good gospel, if you ever want to check it out. But Matthew's version of the parable uses something those don't. They have all this violent imagery. The thing is, that imagery was well known to people back then, but it doesn't really work for us now. The parable of the banquet in Matthew is the third in a string of parables about judgment, and they are in response to Jesus' authority being questioned by the high priests. The first one that we heard a few weeks ago was the parable of the two sons who were going to work in the vineyard. The second one was last week's, the parable of the wicked vineyard tenants, and this is the third one. Harsh judgment against those people who do not respond to the invitation of the king. And as always, I start with context, historical context. Now, Matthew here is using an allegory, which means that the characters and the things in the story are stand-ins for something else. And in this case, scholars generally agree that the king is God, the son is Jesus, and the slaves are the prophets. So, when Matthew wrote this version of the story, there were no such things as Christians. There were Jews who believed in Jesus, and then there were Jews that didn't. And also, at the time that this story was written, the temple in Jerusalem had recently been destroyed by Rome. That happened in the year 70. The Jews who believed in Jesus were a very small group, and they were persecuted. And they wondered if they would ever not be repressed by society. So here Matthew is telling them the history of salvation in a story. The king, God, sent the slaves, the prophets, to invite people to follow him to a party, which happens over and over in the Old Testament, right? God calls the people, they follow, but then they fall out, and then they come back. But the prophets were rejected, so God sent Rome to destroy the temple as punishment. That's what Matthew's talking about. But now that that's over, God is inviting more people to the banquet, and everybody is invited this time. And that's where Matthew's audience was at the time of this. This violent imagery was very familiar to them because they had just lived through it. But it's not that familiar to us. Because modern Christians do not tend to think of God as vengeful and punishing anymore, while they did back then. This is why there's such a disconnect between us and this story. All of this stuff made sense to Matthew's contemporaries. The problem is, which isn't really a problem for us, at least in America, that we're not the minority anymore in this country. We're not persecuted or rejected or alienated by the larger group of people. So we can accept today the parable being an allegory for salvation history, but then this little weird thing happens at the end. During the banquet, to which the king had the servants pull people off the street, remember, the king sees a man improperly dressed, and then he says to his attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." What? That's my first reaction. What? It seems strange that a man pulled in off the street would be expected to be dressed in fine clothes, even though he didn't have time to go home and change. But of course, the parable is not real life. It's a story. But I did find in my research that Often back then, when you were invited to attend a wedding, they would give you a robe as you entered the party. So it was yours. He had it, he just didn't want to put it on. So if this changes the whole parable, at the end at least, about an overreacting king to about the man being disrespectful to the king. Now this man came to the party, but then he refused to act appropriately. Thomas Long wrote that the wedding garment symbolizes the Christian life, that it is the baptismal covenant. He wrote that the garment represents putting on the baptismal garment of Christ, being attired in a new self, created in God's likeness, clothing oneself in compassion, in kindness, humility, meekness, and patience of one who belongs to the kingdom. Now, when we're all baptized, some of us were babies, so either we promised or our sponsors promised for us that we would live our lives following the teachings of Christ, which also includes spreading those teachings in the world. Ulrich Luz states the parable is about accepting the invitation, baptism, and belonging to the church, but that doesn't mean anything by itself. The good and the bad live side by side in the church, so the members of the church do not automatically possess salvation. They are capable of losing it. They must demonstrate it by their works. So the end of this parable, it turns out, is a commissioning parable. You can't just say you're a member of the church by name, can't just be baptized and then do nothing. Their lives are to be lived in accordance with the teachings of Jesus. So, in the story, the man wants to be associated with Christ, but he doesn't want to live the Christian life, to fulfill his baptismal promises. So he is thrown into the outer darkness to suffer for eternity. Well, that makes me a bit uncomfortable. Does that make anyone else a bit uncomfortable? I mean, we all have friends, and some of you have kids and grandkids and relatives who could not care less about God, right? They were baptized because it's the tradition, but otherwise not interested. So are we comfortable thinking that our loved ones are going to be damned for all eternity? Well, I'm not, and I don't believe that that's true, personally. But you know, in the end, it doesn't really matter what I think. It doesn't matter what we think, because only God can figure that stuff out for us. Only God can tell the wheat from the weeds, right? To use another parable, crossing parables here. We can't worry about the final judgment or the end of days, because Jesus said no one knows when that's going to be. So why do we always focus on it? I don't know. That's not for us. We are only to invite, like the prophets, never condemn. Instead, we offer support and prayer, and we truly live out our baptisms. We're going to truly wear our robes, showing, to borrow from the baptismal covenant, showing by word and example the love of God. And as we share with others, we should share with them why what we believe is important to us, rather than just saying, you have to believe or else. Because that doesn't really work, does it? This is the commission of today's parable. Once we get past the surface of all that violence and confusion of the king there, we are to act according to our baptisms. Love each other. Treat each other as we want to be treated. Right? It's easy. And always be inviting more people to join us at the banquet. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.